It was Christmas Eve, and I had agreed to house-sit for my aunt and uncle while they visited family out of state. They lived in a large, old Victorian house on the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a holiday card. The house was always decorated extravagantly for Christmas, strings of lights on every gable, wreaths in every window, and a giant, glowing Santa on the front lawn. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The snow had started to fall lightly, giving the neighborhood a picturesque, quiet charm. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon from the enormous Christmas tree in the living room. My aunt had left a plate of cookies on the counter with a note that read, "Enjoy your evening. See you after the holidays." At first, it felt almost too good to be true, a cozy house all to myself, festive decorations, and no one to bother me. But by the time night fell, the house felt far too big. And far too quiet. The first odd thing happened around 8 p.m. I was curled up on the couch, watching a Christmas movie, when I heard a faint sound coming from the upstairs hallway. It was soft at first, like a distant hum. I paused the movie and listened, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was just the old house settling and went back to my popcorn. Half an hour later, the sound returned. This time, it was louder, soft voices singing in unison, their tones low and melodic. It sounded like a choir, but the words were unfamiliar, almost like they weren't in any language I recognized. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I muted the TV and listened, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to drift through the walls, growing louder and softer in waves. My first thought was that it might be coming from outside, so I peeked through the curtains. The street was empty, the snow falling steadily under the glow of the street lamps. The voices continued, echoing faintly through the house. I tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on my imagination. I went to the kitchen to grab a drink, but the sound seemed to follow me, growing louder the closer I got to the back staircase. At this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs, my heart pounding with every creak of the old wooden steps. The hallway was dark and still, the light from my flashlight casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper. The singing had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt oppressive. I checked each room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. The guest rooms were empty, their beds neatly made. The bathroom was spotless, and the windows were shut tight. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I turned to head back downstairs, I heard it again, soft voices singing, this time coming from the attic. I hesitated at the foot of the attic stairs, the narrow wooden steps disappearing into darkness above me. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was just an old house playing tricks on me, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I pulled the string for the attic light. The single bulb flickered weakly, casting dim light over the cluttered space. The attic was cold, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. Boxes were stacked against the walls, and old furniture was covered with white sheets. The singing had stopped again, and the silence was deafening. I shone my flashlight across the attic, scanning every corner. Then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room stood a group of small figures, their backs to me. They were no more than 3 feet tall, their bodies cloaked in tattered, dark robes. Their heads were bowed as if in prayer, and their hands were clasped together. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. The air around them seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that resonated in my chest. Then, as if on cue, they began to sing. The sound was beautiful and haunting, their voices harmonizing in an otherworldly melody. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound filled me with a sense of dread so deep I could barely breathe. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking as it illuminated their faces. Or lack thereof. Their heads were featureless, smooth, and blank like porcelain dolls. Their voices grew louder, more intense, and the hum in the air turned into a vibration so strong it felt like the walls were shaking. I ran. I bolted down the attic stairs, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The singing followed me, echoing through the house like it was coming from everywhere at once. I reached the living room and grabbed my coat and keys, not bothering to lock the door as I fled into the snowy night. As I ran to my car, I glanced back at the house. The windows glowed with a faint, flickering light, and I thought I saw shadows moving inside. The singing was still audible, muffled by the snow but unmistakable. I drove straight to a motel on the edge of town, shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't sleep that night, the sound of their voices replaying in my mind like a broken record. When my aunt and uncle returned a few days later, I didn't tell them what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to. But when I stopped by to drop off their spare key, I noticed something strange. The attic window, which had always been shut tight, was open. And from the snowy lawn, I could hear faint singing drifting through the air. 2 years ago, I decided to spend Christmas alone. It wasn't as sad as it sounds. I had moved to a new city for work and couldn't afford to fly home for the holidays. My parents were understanding, and I promised to FaceTime them in the morning to exchange greetings and catch up. I was looking forward to a quiet day, maybe some hot chocolate, a Christmas movie, and enjoying the festive atmosphere in my small apartment. The day started off just as I'd planned. I woke up early, made myself a hearty breakfast, and spent an hour on the phone with my family. It was heartwarming to see everyone together, even if only through a screen. By noon, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was snowing lightly, and the Christmas decorations lining the streets gave everything a magical glow. That's when I first saw him. I noticed a man walking along the opposite side of the road, bundled up in a heavy coat and scarf. There was nothing particularly unusual about him, but something about his presence unsettled me. He wasn't walking with the casual pace of someone out for a stroll. His steps were deliberate, his posture stiff. I chalked it up to the cold and turned my attention back to the holiday lights. About 20 minutes later, I turned down a side street to loop back toward my apartment. That's when I saw him again. He was walking ahead of me this time, his movements just as rigid and deliberate as before. I paused, my stomach tightening. It was impossible for him to have gotten ahead of me unless he'd cut through someone's yard or sprinted. Still, I told myself it was just a coincidence. I quickened my pace, eager to get home. The man didn't seem to notice me as I passed him, but his presence lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. By the time I reached my apartment building, my unease had grown into a full-blown sense of dread. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, pulling the curtains tightly shut. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that it was just the paranoia of being alone on Christmas. To calm my nerves, I turned on a cheesy holiday movie and poured myself a glass of wine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 7 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. It was soft at first, just a faint tapping. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't have any friends in the area who might stop by unannounced. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I crept to the peephole and peered through. My stomach dropped. It was the man I'd seen earlier, standing inches from the door. His scarf was pulled up to his nose, and his hat cast a shadow over his eyes. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, his breath fogging up the glass. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. Still no response. Instead, he reached for the doorknob and twisted it. The lock held, but the sound sent a surge of panic through me. I backed away, grabbing my phone and dialing 911. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, the men began pounding on the door, each thud reverberating through the small apartment. The pounding stopped abruptly, and when I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They searched the area but found no sign of the man. They assured me he was probably just some drifter looking for a warm place to stay and advised me to keep my doors and windows locked. But the night was far from over. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a loud crash. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The sound had come from the kitchen. Grabbing the closest thing I could find, a heavy book, I crept toward the noise. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The back door was wide open, snow blowing in across the floor. My hands shook as I closed and locked the door. I was certain I had locked it earlier. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the man somehow gotten in? Was he still inside? I searched the apartment room by room, my makeshift weapon clutched tightly in my hand. Everything seemed untouched, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. I couldn't bring myself to go back to bed, so I sat in the living room with all the lights on, waiting for morning. At 3 a.m., I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow. I didn't dare move, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the window, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the tapping started again. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I finally felt brave enough to look outside. The snow outside the window was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But on the glass, written in frost, was a single word. Soon. I moved out of that apartment a week later. I don't know who, or what, that man was, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for another quiet Christmas night. 3 years ago, I spent Christmas with my brother Liam and his wife, Rachel, at their new home in a small, snowy town in Maine. The house was a charming old Victorian they had recently purchased, complete with a wraparound porch, intricate woodwork, and a history that stretched back over a century. They had gone all out with the decorations, lights on every gable, a massive wreath on the front door, and a towering Christmas tree in the living room. I arrived on Christmas Eve, the snow falling softly as I pulled into their driveway. The house looked like something out of a Christmas movie, warm and inviting with its glowing lights and festive decor. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of pine, cinnamon, and the cookies Rachel had been baking. It was picture perfect. But from the moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, a subtle, creeping unease that I couldn't quite explain. Dinner was lively, with laughter and holiday cheer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on you like a heavy weight. And then there was the tree. It was magnificent, a towering evergreen decorated with hundreds of ornaments and twinkling lights. But one ornament stood out, a small, red glass ball hanging near the center of the tree. It wasn't flashy or ornate, but something about it caught my eye. It was darker than the others, almost crimson, and it seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. "Where did you get that one?" I asked, pointing to the ornament. Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" "The red one," I said. "It's unique." She exchanged a glance with Liam, her expression puzzled. "I don't remember putting that one on the tree." We laughed it off as a mix-up, maybe it had come with the box of decorations, or maybe one of the kids from their neighborhood had added it. Still, I couldn't stop glancing at it throughout the evening. It seemed to shift slightly, as if it wasn't hanging quite right. Once or twice, I thought I saw it sway gently, even though the room was still. Around 10 p.m., Rachel and Liam headed upstairs to put the final touches on the guest room while I stayed in the living room, scrolling through my phone. The tree lights cast a warm glow over the room, and the snow outside blanketed the world in silence. That's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched hum, so soft I almost missed it. It was coming from the tree. I set my phone down and approached cautiously, my eyes fixed on the red ornament. The hum grew louder as I got closer, a low, resonating tone that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I reached out to touch the ornament, my fingers hovering just inches away. It spun slowly on its hook. I yanked my hand back, my heart racing. The hum stopped instantly, leaving the room in heavy silence. I stared at the ornament, waiting for it to move again, but it hung still and lifeless. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by the late hour and the holiday stress. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I woke to the sound of movement downstairs. It was faint, like the rustling of branches or the soft creak of wood under weight. I assumed it was Liam or Rachel grabbing a late-night snack and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone and crept downstairs, the cold air biting against my skin. The living room was dark except for the glow of the tree lights, which cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. The red ornament caught my eye immediately. It was no longer hanging on the tree. Instead, it was lying on the floor near the fireplace, its crimson surface gleaming in the light. As I approached, I noticed something else. The pine needles around the ornament were blackened, as if they'd been scorched. The faint smell of burnt wood hung in the air. I reached down to pick up the ornament, but the moment my fingers touched it, a sharp, searing pain shot through my hand. I yelped and pulled back, cradling my hand against my chest. The ornament rolled slightly, coming to rest at the edge of the rug. The hum returned, louder now, filling the room with its eerie vibration. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Shadows seemed to ripple across the walls, converging toward the tree. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its body obscured by the darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin points of red light that burned into me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, as the figure stepped closer. The hum grew deafening, the sound wrapping around me like a vice. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, the room silent and still. The tree lights flickered weakly, and the red ornament was back on the branch where it had been before. I scrambled to my feet and ran upstairs, waking Liam and Rachel. They listened to my story, their faces pale with disbelief, but when we went back downstairs, everything was as it had been. The ornament hung motionless, the room quiet and undisturbed. The next morning, I left early, unable to stay in the house a moment longer. Liam and Rachel called me later that week to tell me the ornament had shattered unexpectedly while they were packing up the decorations. They found nothing inside, just shards of dark glass. But even now, I can't forget the hum, the scorched needles, or the figure that watched me from the shadows. Every Christmas, I think about that ornament, and I wonder where it came from, and what it brought with it.